Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Hive Jive with Miss Natalie and myself. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing, John? How's
I'm
everyone?
doing good. You were dancing over there as if there was music playing, and kind of there
I
is
love
when
your
editing's done, but
I love your energy when you say welcome back to the Hive Jive. You
the
just really
Hive Jive.
I really like it. She says with her French accent.
Well, you're prepping. You're getting ready to actually go back and visit family and have a trip, so you gotta
Yeah.
you gotta work on that accent so that you sound more native when you get there.
I've been practicing I don't need to practice my French, but I was practicing Italian. I'm learning some words and everything. So now everything is off. All
That's
bets
it's all mixed together.
all bets are off.
All bets are off. Awesome. Well, we are back to chat with you guys this week and do just kind of a little bit of a touch base follow up on some of the topics that we've discussed so far. We just had Miss Angela Tollerson on last week going through and talking about some very interesting concepts from northern Montana. And there was a few little aspects in there that Natalie and I wanted to kind of point out and circle back around to because she made some very good points that, we just want to kind of hammer those in just a little bit more, just so you can really think about it and maybe tie that together back with other aspects of your beekeeping. So, number one, and these are all things too that we have talked about on Patreon at some point in time or another. We've had various episodes that some of those have even now moved from Patreon over here to the main platform. So, selecting for the wrong thing, I believe, was a title of one of the beekeeper chats. There's other ones in there about queen longevity and colony health and things along those lines that all kind of play back into this. But the one thing was the concept that even though we like to theorize that we have all of these different breeds of bees,
Mhm.
in the United States, we really just have one massive mixing pool of genetics. And they're going to have probably a little bit of everything because they do open mate, the queen mates with lots of different drones. The offspring can have a little bit of mixture of that in there. So it is really going to kind of be a mixed bag. You do have to figure out, obviously, which genetics are going to work better for your region and your area. But one thing that I thought was interesting, and this is kind of a little bit of a side note, I forgot to bring it up during the episode, but it is something that I thought was fascinating. So in Arkansas, they did some research on collecting feral or wild honeybees and doing genetic testing on them. And they actually found genetic markers for the original black bee.
Ooh,
Now this is
you're right.
predating, yeah, this is predating whenever we started bringing over the Italians and the other stuff. The first bee that we had out here was actually that black European bee. And they thought that it was gone and it was literally basically, quote unquote, like extinct in our area because now everything is flooded with these other genetics. But what they found is that some of those genetic lines did swarm, did survive, and have intermixed in with the local population. And so now the local bees in that area where they were doing the testing still have genetic tracers and markers for that original black European bee, that's kind of fascinating because that's not one that you can get today. That's not out there on the market. You're not going to be ordering a black European bee. You're going to get a Caucasian, or well, probably not even that. The Italians, Carniolans, and Russians. Those are the three big ones that you're going to see out there. And then there are some other little offshoots, but I thought that was very fascinating though, that they could be in there.
Right. And I think that with the advances of genetic testing and DNA, on ancestry.com, whatever, that we are doing for humans, we can do some of that also for animals in a ways that's a lot bit more in depth. And I think it's fascinating to realize that there are ancestries all the way back to European strains. Obviously, they would have to be because the honeybees were not initially native in the United States. But what's really fascinating is that, and Angela touched up upon it, is you've got really, even if you have traces and genetic traces of some of those older strains and more rare strains of bees that are typically European, you really don't have a whole lot of diversity in the United States. And in particular, you have basically the group of people that are American Russian Bee Federation, I think it's called, that's really doing a really controlled program to keep their genetics as pure as possible. And so if you're getting Russian bees that are from these people that are certified, you're getting Russian bees, right? But I loved what she was using, and I know you're smiling, but she was talking about flavors
Yeah,
when it comes
yeah,
to everything else was just basically different flavors of the same bees, the mostly Italian based, maybe a little bit of carniolan, but mostly Italian based, and some small variations out there. So I would like to add, I think that a lot of the bees that kind of like have been bred locally, with leveraging the swarming instinct and all of that, and open mating, obviously with TCAs that are not saturated with specific genetics, you end up with locally adapted survivor stock that's more really adapted to your particular cycles of weather and forage. And that's probably a little bit more differentiated than the regular Italian, phenotypes, and just kind of like those flavors.
yeah.
So that's kind of interesting, because if you're going to go and buy bees from a breeder, unless you're buying Russian bees, you're really going to get basically everybody's getting the same thing minus small variations, right?
Yeah.
And as far as that's concerned, that could potentially explain why a lot of the colonies out there that are sold are not really tolerant or resistant, and in general not very resilient, not very fit to fend off for themselves, and instead need more interventions and treatments basically than the ones that are either Russians, which are very resilient naturally, or the locally adapted survivor stock. So and that kind of ties back into what we were discussing about the 2 to 3 times the amount of colonies
Yeah.
in the wild versus what's managed, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's fascinating to see that really what's resilient naturally kind of like stands out, right?
It does. It works out really well. She also mentioned, that sometimes when they're going through and doing that, they're picking by color, for instance.
Yes.
And I had a great example of that actually just over the weekend where we came across a colony that is, and we'll because of the in light of this conversation, we will say is supposedly headed by a Russian queen.
Mhm.
It is a Russian queen that came from a package through a breeder. Well, I don't even know if they're the breeder. We'll say a distributor in southern Arkansas down around Little Rock. And that queen, at one point, this is the colony that in March was doing amazing and wanted to swarm already. So we split it. We took the mother queen and we put her into the new split with all the stuff and shook the bees and all that fun stuff. Left the original colony to raise the new queen. Well, we went back into it to make sure everything was looking great on Saturday. And the colony had successfully raised the queen. She had
Oh,
made it
good.
back. She had mated. She was laying. They were drawing out the second box. Like everything looked awesome. And then we were like, well, let's go ahead and look at the other colony where we put the original queen because we haven't
Right.
really messed with them since we did the split. Let's see what it looks like. They had already swarmed.
Oh, because they were
So,
so invested.
no, they're in a double deep setup.
Oh.
So they had
Yeah.
plenty of space from the beekeeper's perspective, but it was a prime example of those bottom frames were not drawn out. And
Oh.
so they finished filling up what they needed to in that top box, decided they had hit critical mass, and they were going to swarm again. But the funny thing is, that is the same queen that tried to swarm in March in the original box. And here, just 2 months later, they already swarmed and left again. But this inspection, there were queens literally emerging from the queen
Oh.
cups as we're doing the inspection. So I'm grabbing queens as they're coming out and we're pulling off queen cups. We're putting them into cages and containers. And it was a great example. I had two of them side by side. One of them was almost pure black with light tan fuzz stripes. The other one was amber at the top of the thorax that faded to black at the bottom and then had the tan stripes. Same
Wow.
queen, but the offspring looked completely different. And if you were going through and you're doing that genetic picking by color, then you could grab that black one and you could say, well, this is a Russian queen.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
but then what's that other one? Because she came from the same mom.
So genetics is very similar, and they just have different dads, right?
Yep, different dads,
Uh,
different color patterns on their bodies.
that reminds me of a story that Les Crowder tells all the time. he was working with a very famous queen breeder, large commercial queen breeder, and we're not going to give the areas, we're not going to give
Nope.
names,
But
nothing.
I used to love to order queens from there until I heard this story.
And so they were selling two kinds. I think there was Italian, and I forget what the other
They have
kind was.
Carniolan and
Carniolan and
yep.
Italians, right? And so they supposed to be slightly different in terms of phenotypes, but at the same, but also they're supposed to control which one, which yard is doing, which colonies got which kind of style of queen. And Les was telling the story that he would use to go and just pull out queens, or I forget if it was him pulling them out or if it was somebody. Anyway, the person that
it was a lady that had apprenticed with him,
yes.
and she worked out there and was basically told, if it's black, put it over here and mark it as this, and if it's not, put it over there and mark it as that.
And then if you don't know and whatever, just pull whatever and
Yeah.
put it in. Yeah, if I'm missing this many of this kind, then you pull it, and you make up the numbers as you can.
Yep.
So there was really not that much control, and as far as the genetics was concerned, so you don't know what you're getting.
Well, and okay, so that begs the question too, are they really even trying to influence the drone congregation area? Are they really trying to flood it? Do they really have everything separated out? Or are all these queens just coming from one massive area and we're just picking by color, right?
Right. And that's the other thing is like, can you really genuinely, you can increase the chances and the statistics probability of you getting the genetics that you want by putting colonies of um, drone mother colonies, I
Yeah,
think they're called,
drone colonies, yeah.
around the area of the drone congregation areas. But there's so many drones. There's thousands and thousands of drones over there. So that really, you're not. I was hearing a master beekeeper at a meeting recently, very known to actually to you as well. And she was like, "Oh yeah, no, those genetics are controlled. Those areas are saturated, and they know exactly what kind of genetics they're getting." I was like, "What? No, they can't because mating happens in flight and competition is fierce and it's just a probabilities game. You
Right.
do not know what you're getting, and
Well,
and you increase your chances of knowing with whom she's mated, but by only a very small percentage."
right. And you said it just a little bit ago. The evidence is out there now that there's 3 times the amount of
Yes.
wild feral colonies versus managed colonies. So even if you're trying to flood that area, there's 3 times as many feral colonies potentially around you that are putting their genetics into the mix as well. And then if you are in a southern state, you have the whole scoot-a-lot of genetics. And they like to be known for out competing in every possible way.
Right.
They fly faster, they're more aggressive,
They
they're more
fought earlier.
defensive, they emerge earlier, like all these things. So they can wiggle their way in there. And it only takes one. You just need one drone with those genetics to get his in the mix, and then a percentage of every egg that that queen lays can potentially have his genetics. And then the
And then
way that escalates is now, if that colony swarms and raises a new queen and that queen happened to have a marker of those genetics, and then the process repeats and you get another quarter of genetics that came from that same type of line, that's how your colony can shift over time.
right, it's kind of like grains of pepper, right? The more grains of pepper you're getting into your queen, the spicier the whole colony is going to end up
That's
being.
right. Starts going from black pepper to maybe some red chili pepper, maybe to
Exactly.
cayenne.
No, but so
Back
it's
to
kind of
flavors.
like,
That was actually, now we really have flavors.
and we've gone full circle. It's all about it. Oh, by the way, that's a good, hey, it's a good segue to what's going to happen next week, right? The cooking corner, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So at the end of this episode, we will actually have a segment from Ken. If you guys remember back in some of the, I think it was the 3rd season, Ken was doing his cooking corner where he would use honey to go through and do things to make different types of who knows what concoctions. And so we will have a little segment from Ken at the end of this where you can go through and check that out as well. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, oh, yeah, and that's kind of like a flavor cooking, recipe kind of a episode today.
Yeah, that's the good kind of flavor that you want.
Yeah.
Not the spicy cayenne flavor
The
that got
controlled
mixed into your
kind
queen
of.
genetics.
Yeah,
So
his is more based on honey, right? A little bit
yeah,
sweeter.
yeah,
Yes.
it is all it's supposed to be.
So yeah,
Oh,
no, I mean it's kind of hard to control any of that stuff. So
it
I
is.
mean,
Well, and so in the selecting for the wrong thing episode, we talked about how if you're doing grafting, that is you as a person who literally knows nothing about the genetics of each individual egg, because again, it's a mix. None of those girls in there, or very few of those girls, are 100% related. Most of them are half sisters to their other sisters in the colony because there's so much genetic change in there. So if you're going through and you're selecting, not only could you potentially select the larva that is too old, or you could potentially damage the larva, you may be selecting a larva that the bees would have never chosen for a queen. And there's evidence of a royal lineage that they talk about sometimes that only shows up in drones and in queens, but is rarely found in the workers because the workers will actually remove those eggs if it's something that they don't want to raise, or purposefully select those eggs if they need to make an emergency queen cell. And we don't do that. We just like arbitrarily go through and we're like, oh, this one looks good. This one looks about the right size, and we pluck them out of there. So
what really gets to me is that whole grafting anyway, because you're not selecting. Okay, look, the eggs and egg for 3 days, and then the queen's a larvae for 4 to 5 days on average. And so if you're waiting to have a larvae that you can actually see, that's almost 1 day old. That's 25% at least of her, I mean, as 25% of her larval stage, which means for that 25% of the beginning of her life, what matters the most, she hasn't been fed the royal jelly that's super nutritious and that has the a lot more mandibular gland secretions, as opposed to some of the hypopharyngeal gland secretions. That's more the mix that the workers are getting. I mean, queens get a different jelly than the workers, and the drones get drone jelly. So they all have their own diet, and all of a sudden you've got a diet, basically an underfed queen from the get-go,
yeah.
right? It's
Well,
kind of hard to.
that the studies when they did the research on the nutrition of the bees and what created the queen is not necessarily so much what she's eating, but what she's not eating, because there's substances in the bee bread and in the nectar and in the honey that actually cause the stunting of the growth and the development, the lack of certain organs, and results in a worker bee versus a fully developed queen bee. So
Right.
if you wait too long and you get a bee that has already been fed some regular brood food instead of the queen food, now you've got this change where maybe she's not as big, maybe she doesn't have the capacity that she should. It can have developmental issues on her.
Yeah, so my understanding, and I don't know if I'm correct, but my understanding is that they don't get fed the actual bee bread, brood food until at least 3 days of age, or 2.5 or something. So if you do select for 1 day old, you're still probably not getting exposed to that. But the jelly has a completely different composition, and it varies over time, and definitely doesn't have, so the workers don't get as much mandibular gland secretions, which is really the key. I mean, it's really much more nutritious. The epigenetics itself, yes, it's going to shut off some genetics, some chromosomes. I'm sorry, some genes, if you give them bee bread, and it's going to turn them into workers, and their morphology is going to be completely different. But if you're not, if you're still not feeding them the royal jelly from the get-go, you're still not going to get the same quality of queens as if you had queens that was fed by the bees as being queens, and in particular under swarming conditions and or supersedure conditions even, right? Because they want her, and so they feed her from the get-go that way. Emergency is a little different, but they can still get some okay, queens from that, as long as they had eggs that are just about to emerge. I
Yeah.
mean, to
Well, and no, I mean you were correct. Eggs that are just about literally ready to hatch, they can single
Right.
those out and say, okay, this cell right here, we're going to use this one, and they go through and they can use that, and they're the ones that get to pick. So they're the
Right.
ones that know is this a good genetic profile for this offspring to be used as a queen? And if not, let
Right.
me move on to the next cell and let me look. So,
Right.
while we're on the topic though of genetics and drone congregation areas and all that kind of stuff, one of the things that we talked about over on the Patreon episode when we did that second half with Angela was the fact that we went a little bit more in depth on her being surrounded by a commercial
Right.
beekeeper and by commercial beekeeping operations. And one of the questions was, how do you mitigate that? Because they travel the country, they're bringing all kinds of things that they've encountered back to their little holdover place, and then their bees could be, she said, they rob a lot of times because they're not getting enough food that's oversaturated for the area. So the commercial bees are robbing out all of the regular urban beehives that the people that don't travel would
Hmm.
normally have year round. But then that also means that your drone congregation areas are flooded
Have
with
been
bees,
polluted.
yeah,
Yes.
from these commercial operations. And there is a queen breeder that we've talked about before in the past where, and again, we won't say names, but
I mean,
where it made you stop and scratch your head because one half of the family sells treatment free bees, the other half of the family absolutely does not sell that, and the two operations are not far enough apart for there not to be an intermixing of the drones and drone congregation areas. This would be the same concept if you've got a commercial beekeeper with 1,000 hives parked right next door to you. You've got 1,000 colonies of meh drones that are now going to be flooding all those drone congregation areas. How do you keep up with that? What do you do?
well, and then that's where you end up having to almost rely on purchasing queens every year, right? Because if you let them swarm or requeen themselves in any way, now you've got a disproportionate amount of those inferior drone genetics that are going to pollute your queens, your virgin queen spermatheca, right? And that could be inferior genetics that are not fit. That could be also damaged gametes, right, from the drones that have been exposed to treatments,
That's
and
true.
and and
Or
and so
not even just the treatments, what they're out there in nature foraging on, because they're be
right,
taking to the most toxic places, the almond orchards and the places that we grow our
right,
foods, pesticides, fungicides, you name it, and they're coming into contact with that and bringing it back into the colony with them.
yeah,
So it's like
but
the perfect storm of the worst case scenarios.
right, but to be clear, I'm pretty sure that there's very few commercial beekeepers that do not treat their bees
That's true too.
because they kind of have to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Treating for mites specifically. Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of things in there that could go awry. And one of the concepts that Angela had mentioned was that she openly advocates for people to buy from specific queen breeders when she has queens that she knows are of a good stock. She will almost basically give them away, where she
Yep.
goes out there and says, hey, here,
That's
everybody in
retail.
the club, take these queens and requeen your colonies, and let's try to get some good genetics in there, because that is kind of one of the only ways to combat that. But it's literally the small dot of color in a sea of red that you're
Mhm.
trying to slowly permeate and change. And maybe if you're lucky, you can wind up with purple or something instead of red, but you
Right.
can slowly over time try to interject those new genetics in there. But I can see where that would be a very frustrating uphill battle based on your surroundings and what's going on around you. If you've got other beekeepers that aren't necessarily in it for the bees and as thoughtful as you would like the beekeepers in your area to be, then you have to deal with all of the consequences and unintended consequences that their bees are bringing into your colonies.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, it's got to be frustrating, but it's at that point, there's only so much you can control, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Oh man, I feel for her in that aspect. I don't know. I don't know what I would do from that.
You know what's funny is that then you you hear a lot of basically grumbling about the people that do not treat, and they're the ones that are contaminating or putting pressure on the other colonies. And I'm like, I don't understand how that's even a concept because that's not how it works.
Well, you're
The more
right.
yeah, I mean, you want those more resilient genetics. You want those wild genetics. This is actually what's helping those commercial strains to get stronger and fitter.
That's
So,
right. Yeah, because it is, again, it goes back to that three times the amount of feral colonies out there than there are managed. That means they're thriving and surviving just fine without intervention from a beekeeper, without
Right.
interventions from treatments. And you know what else? Those bees are also not being put on trucks and moved across the country. They're not
Right.
being exposed to all of these other things. They're not being exposed to, the amount of diseases and new pests that they could be exposed to.
Right.
Because if you do that, if you have one colony that has some new exotic, heaven forbid, either parasite or virus that's novel, all of a sudden that one colony gets put on this truck, and that truck
Yep.
goes from state to state to state. The whole time that truck is also losing those bees, because you can't tell me that every single forager is back inside that colony before you load it on the truck and go.
Right.
They may not have made it home. They may have drifted into another colony nearby. Drones could be being released. And so now you've got drones that could be going out and mating and potentially spreading this or carrying, diseases and pests and things along with them. So it literally takes one season,
Right.
one agricultural cycle for a commercial beekeeper to potentially spread something in a circle all the way across the entire United States.
Right.
So, which is
I
also
think
why our genetics are all one big thing.
that's right. It's a big soup that's getting stirred regularly every year. I like that concept, though. I would encourage everybody to, if you have locally adapted survivor stock, fit you just really good stock that's doing well naturally, to if you are willing to help out your neighbors and grow, that area where you can raise those bees, share those queen cells. If you get some, just kind of stay on top of it, or rear your own queens from swarm cells, or not really emergency, but just kind of make sure that you spread those genetics that way. You're already helping out because you're casting those drone genetics. And each swarm that or split that you're making is going to help increasing that population. But I think that by sharing the queen cells, you're doing a much better job, because you're not increasing the number of colonies that you're putting out there, which, as we discussed, can be an issue when you have too many colonies in one area. We don't want to put too much pressure on the environment and the other pollinators. We want to be mindful of that. But by sharing those swarm cells of good quality stock, you're helping everybody around, and you're also improving the genetic pool around the area and making up for some of the pressures that are not so good.
That's true.
Yeah.
It takes everybody thinking
Takes a
through it.
village.
It
Yes.
takes a village to raise a colony. At
Right.
this point, it might
Colonies.
take a colony to raise a village. I'm not sure. So
Vice versa. Yeah, it goes both ways, I
it
guess.
does. It can go both ways. So, if you want to hear more of this conversation with Nathalie and I, you can join us over on Patreon. We are going to continue our discussion there.
This Hive Jive production was made possible by amazing patrons like you, and we appreciate your support. To all our Hive Jive junkies out there, you truly are the bee's knees.